Hello, I'm Farah Nazarali, and I'm really delighted to be here with author and educator Derek Gladwin. He is a researcher who's interested in transformations in culture and society through environmental, narrative, and arts-based education. And we're here to talk about the power and qualities of storytelling, and in particular, your newest book, Rewriting Our Stories: Education, Empowerment, and Well-Being. Welcome.
Great. Thanks. Great to be here.
I want to start by asking, what's the story behind the book? This book is all about storytelling, personal, relationship, individual, collective. Tell us about the background context to this whole book being written.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's interesting because in many ways, it is true that my own storying process got me to write about storytelling. And, you know, in some ways, this book has manifested out of the professional identity that I have as an educator, as a professor, as a teacher. But in many ways, it's also emerged from my own personal identities and how, you know, through my own practices and self-care and well-being, I've tried to negotiate, you know, life as it came to me. And so I think what it came down to is thinking about, well, I guess I'll rewind that just a minute to say, for me at least, and I don't know if many of us can relate to this, I feel like maybe over the last 15 years or so, you know, fear in society had kind of been this kind of energy force that seemed to have increased and get more and greater, and it's everywhere. And for me, it was just a slow build where it's not like one day I just woke up in fear. But I think over time, all these kinds of fear stories, it just kept manifesting in media and friends and around friends or the news that I was reading. Suddenly, I just realized how I was swimming in so much fear constantly. And it just sort of slowly came up on me all of a sudden. And I realized it was affecting how I was making decisions and how I was living my life and the ways I was forging my relationships. And I just, you know, made a decision that I wanted to do something about that, but I didn't really know what to do, you know, other than the typical forms of, you know, good yoga practice or trying to, you know, do meditation or therapy or whatever of those modes that are available. But one thing that occurred to me was when I was teaching a literature course, I realized how really storytelling has been this galvanizing force for so long about humanity really coping with all sorts of challenges and ways in which we sort of address our own existence. And it also occurred to me that storytelling really is that fundamental way in which we narrate our own lives, not just history, but who we are as people and the social worlds that are around us. And then so I just took that one step further, and I kind of reflected in that process that, you know, in many ways, this fear that I'm engulfed in are just fear stories. They're just stories that have been created out of all sorts of circumstances. And I have the power to recreate and rewrite those stories myself and think of the stories that I want to tell for me, or I want my social worlds and my relationships to be a part of. So, you know, that was kind of that kernel. And then I thought to myself also, well, you know, I do teach humanities and arts-based education. And I've always been a proponent of how this can be life-changing, this kind of work, because it forces us to reflect on our values and our capacity to make change in the world and our perceptions. And so why wouldn't storytelling be this great, you know, methodology, as it were, sort of in the academic world, but just this great practice to always return to and thinking about who are we? What do we want out of our lives? What do we want out of our relationships? How do we want the next day to go? How do we want the next week to go? And how that's really all generated from our own ability to think about stories and the stories that influence us versus the stories that we generate ourselves.
So one of the words that you mentioned in the last few parts of your answer, which I really wanted to talk about, is the word generative. What is a generative story? Because this is something you mentioned in the book, and for those people who might not know what it means, what is generative?
Well, the way I'm using it, I mean, generative is a term that can be used in many ways. The way I'm using it is a way in which we're giving something life, almost a life-giving process, a way of building something. I mean, you could say positive. I mean, that could be a simple way of imagining it, but I think it's more complex than just it's a positive narrative. I think it's a way in which one induces growth. Maybe a metaphor to think about this is planting a garden and creating good soil that your plants can actually thrive in is a generative process. The soil itself and the care and the what you put into the soil, how you take care of that soil, is thinking about trying to build a generative garden. The garden comes out of that soil. So there's a way in which it provides this foundation that can create something that generates, an outcome that is something that you might want to see. But if you don't know what you want to see, it might still generate positive outcomes. Like a garden, you might plant tomato plants, you might plant other herbs, you might plant some veg, and some of those might come out and some of them might not. You don't know when it comes to gardening. So part of that is you create the soil and then you see what happens and you just observe what grows and what thrives and why things are thriving and why they're not. So if you're building your life on generative stories, you're always thinking about what are those stories or what is that soil that really can be that foundation for myself or for society, where you're generally going to get a nice thriving garden, just depending on the year after year. And you never quite know what it might be, but it's coming from a place of a strong foundation.
It's such a beautiful metaphor, especially in context of our society right now. You mentioned the forces of fear and the culture of fear that kind of cumulatively had an impact for you personally. It seems like those forces have multiplied and intensified in the last 10 years, and most certainly in the last year with the pandemic. What is the story that how are you trying to make sense of this time right now in context of this intensification of fear?
Yeah, well, crises can be, challenging times, but they can also be times of opportunity and possibility. And so, holding those two thoughts at the same time without, sort of thinking it's only a time of transformation and change, but it is a time of challenge and tragedy and difficulty. But within that, I think that there's always that opportunity. And it seems to me that the world is in a transition where we are trying to figure out what the global story is. And we've seen this really in the last 20 years developing. So this isn't just all of a sudden. I mean, there's been sort of 5 major pandemics in the last 20 years, 5 different ones. Now, they haven't gone global in the same kind of way, but they're close calls. So in many ways, you can see, even just from that aspect, but also from political aspect, from social aspect, there's been this kind of acceleration. And it's almost like we've been in a crescendo in the last year, right? And it felt like something sort of broke the last few months, even though we're in the middle of the pandemic and there was this shift. And it feels like the momentum is pushing for more and more for a different story, a different political story, a different economic story, a different social story, and all the ways in which we want to create a society, create a world that is that generative space. We want to plant better soil, to go back to that space. So, for me, I draw on the words of the novelist Arundhati Roy when the pandemic first came out, was first happening. She wrote an article that kind of went viral, where she talked about the pandemic and, of course, all the sociocultural and political aspects of it. But one line that really stood out is she said the pandemic is a portal, right? It's this ability for us to transform through this possibility. So are we going to use this as a possibility, as an opportunity? And I think that question is still out there. But on a daily basis, if you look for it, I see it in the news, maybe not in the mass media, but I see it quite often, where there are some pretty magical stories being rewritten across the world right now, and some ways in which we are rethinking how we want things to be once things stabilize a little bit from this pandemic. And this book came out. This book was conceived before the pandemic. It just happened to come out during the pandemic. So in many ways, there were all these signs out before. It just now we kind of hit this moment, and these are the kinds of moments I think you look back in history. They're difficult to live through for the people that are living through them, but you look back in history and they're monumental. They're place markers of where you can see these shifts and these transitions. And there's no doubt in my mind, at least, that this is going to be one of those markers. And I am of the belief, maybe I'm a little too optimistic, but I am of the belief that it is transitioning into a more generative space. And, the kinds of stories that are trying to be told are getting larger and larger in terms of from a human and more than human kind of aspect, as opposed to just from a very singular, one-dimensional sort of kind of Western paradigm that we've been clinging on to for a good 200 plus years now. So,
and interesting that you say that, because that's also a big part of your book, which I think also differentiates it from other kinds of self-help books, is that it really integrates the personal storytelling and larger fabric within a collective storytelling and the culture and the society that we live in. What else can you say about the integration of those two that really are so important in narrative theory?
well, I think for me, the other aspect of what inspired me to write this book is, I for many years have I've read many kind of self-help, wellness, well-being kinds of books, and some resonate and some don't. In general, I like the idea of trying to support other people's processes and having them reflect and heal in their own lives. That's a fabulous aim. But for me, many of them have fallen short in terms of really getting into, well, for two reasons. One, sometimes they isolate the individual and make it sound like it's all about the individual. You can change yourself or you can't, and it's all up to you. And one thing that I really wanted to emphasize in this book is that it really isn't about the individual. We are very integrated socially and culturally. And I wanted to decenter that idea of the self, that the self is an integrated aspect to society. And the ways in which, or the aspects of how fear might come into our lives or how we write our stories are very influential on those belief systems that have come into our lives, through our families, through our societies, through our cultures, through education, through religion, you name it. There's all these different ways in which narrative has been constructed in our lives. And some of those stories are fabulous and they support us, and some of those stories aren't supportive of us, and they're not seeking our best interest. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is the idea of how that self has sort of been developed in a Western or a sort of Eurocentric paradigm, when of course there are many global paradigms historically that we could draw on and look at that might be quite different. But the European Western world has a very specific individualistic kind of paradigm that is connected and very much driven by larger belief systems like colonialism, like capitalism, and these were generated very much for oppressive reasons. So it's no wonder we're having oppressive consequences happening out of those, and the stories attached to those can be incredibly oppressive for many people. So I think for me it was important to sort of delineate that there's a history and we're not disconnected from that history. And there's a reason that we feel fear all the time, or there's a reason that we struggle to feel integrated in society, and why that might be. And I think for me, it's also quite, I don't know, it feels connective to think I'm not alone, that many of us are feel these things, and we're very connected. And it's not just up to one person to make that change. There's our stories are so integrated with everyone else's stories. And actually that can be a real empowering thing to embrace and to think about how we're not isolated. And maybe I'll just end with this. And of course, this is what we're seeing in the pandemic, is that there's kind of this contrast between those who think it's an individualistic problem versus a social problem. And pandemics don't play by those rules. A pandemic, doesn't care if you're an individual or not. It's actually about the society. And we're in these social situations where there's a social contract, and how we engage in that social contract is very much about public health. And so the idea of just living as individuals and not being affected by that actually affects people much more than if we think about how we integrate and interact in that social context that we're in. So, even in that aspect, you can see it playing out. But those are aspects, I think, where I took a little different approach with this, and oftentimes doesn't come up so much, but it's something I wanted to see as a reader. So I just said, well, why not go into that, even if it might kind of derail a little bit from the process. And, in many ways, the last chapter, or the second to last chapter, I kind of outlined the stages and the process of the book, but it kind of took the whole book to get there, because I realized there was such a lead up to sort of the why we're here question versus the, how what do we do about it? The why was so big. And even in the attempt that I did, of course, it was just a smattering of what I could, what one could have talked about in terms of the why. But that's oftentimes a piece that I ask myself when I'm listening to a speaker or reading a book about, how do we make these changes? Well, it's like, well, why do we need to make these changes? What's going on, and what are the options? And, those larger questions just oftentimes come up for me.
Yes, as I'm hearing you speak, I also think about the change in our understanding of our cultural story in light of all that's happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, anti-racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and that the story that we've been told, or maybe we've told ourselves, may not be the actual reality, and there's a different story that's emerging. And the importance of generating stories that empower us individually and collectively. Any thoughts on those stories that really are so relevant in our political scene and culture today?
Those are the stories that need to be told, and there needs to be space for them to be told. And I think that's a big takeaway that for, I think, society, is that those stories are starting to be told, right? And we see they're having to be told through really, horrific examples of, like with George Floyd, and how that sort of really, of course, Black Lives Matter was already a movement before that happened, but that really went global once that moment happened. That was a connective social aspect that where everyone sort of said, okay, this is a story that's been trying to be told for a very long time, and we need to make space for this story. This needs to be not a peripheral story, but these need to be the dominant stories. And I think that's what we're starting to see. And in terms of when I was talking about the optimism that I have on some level, a cautious optimism, maybe I might say, about how I see shifts happening, it's seeing these kinds of stories, not just being told, but more and more people hearing them. They've been being told, but now people are starting to hear them. They're starting to see that, movements like Black Lives are telling a story, and they're telling many stories. And so, that's a big process. I think also, the idea of how we think about, how we decolonize. I mean, here in Canada, of course, there's a history of colonization, and that history is still going, and we're still in the presence of it. And yet there are still stories that are being told that are trying to decolonize that, whether it's in education, or whether it's in politics, or whether it's in the arts. And you have novelists and graphic novelists and other forms of storytellers who are speaking back to that directly. I think those are all, excellent examples of the ways in which the sociocultural aspects of how we rewrite our stories are happening. And as a result, because of that, you have maybe more of the more corporately inclined media starting to tell those stories, because they see more masses of people are embracing that. And again, that's somewhat of a positive sign, that not necessarily that it's monetary based on the news organization's part, but that they acknowledge that these things are important. One example that just recently happened is with, in Georgia in the US, they signed into practice a voting law that restricts voters even more so. And the population that they were restricting was specifically targeted at African-American voters, who primarily voted for the left. And so what was interesting is how, Major League Baseball, who's not a really strong political entity, they're a major sports franchise, decided not to hold an all-star game there because they didn't want to perpetuate, if you will, that story, right? That story was an old story that no longer they felt as a large entity had an appetite to support, because their own players, would be affected by that. But also, this isn't the kind of thing that you want to participate socially. And then other corporations have been on board with that. And there's more to say about that, but it's a tiny example, I guess, of how influential narratives can be. And those political narratives and stories come out of even those kinds of moments, and the ways in which those might affect major populations. So so I think those are also great examples of how we are rewriting our story, and it's a much larger story than is, maybe per se our own specific communities, our own specific societies, but how you can see these examples globally and how they are affecting social justice, and more generative forms, I guess, of of justice in general.
One of the questions I had when I was reading the book and thinking about generative story is one story that has been lost very recently, and that is the story of climate change. Or I know that you've given talks on climate anxiety, and I've even heard the term climate hope. What is the story that's really going to generate the momentum and the culture that really shifts our relationship with the environment?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. And you're right. And in some ways, strangely, the climate story has been a little muted, a little subdued during the pandemic, which is interesting because we have seen, because of the slowdown of society, because of all the lockdowns, we've seen some improvements in terms of carbon in the atmosphere and air pollution in various cities around the world. So there has been some interesting evidence around how society, with some tiny even shifts in a year, can actually make some significant impact, and what that means long term. I have always found it interesting. I mean, I've researched environmental literacy and sustainability education for about 25 years, since the 90s. And of course, I've sort of read the history and been a part of the history. And, the movement in North America really galvanized in the 60s, although there are, of course, progenitors of it earlier than that, but as a real major social movement, in sort of the Western context, we're looking at about 60 years now. And interestingly, there's been a lot of change, but the story hasn't changed too much. It feels a little bit like we're still trying for people to hear the right story, that if we keep, doing business as usual, this is going to be a problem. And of course, now we have mounting evidence of it, but there was a lot of evidence of this 60 years ago. So it's not as though all of a sudden we've been given all this evidence. I mean, these were the predictions of melting ice glaciers and temperatures increasing, carbon in the atmosphere, all the ways in which we monitor these things. And I do think about this in terms of story, because I think one of the ways that we might be able to influence society around this, and influence those who look at climate change as a belief system, not as a science, you either believe it or you don't, versus there's evidence for it or there's not. There's two very different kinds of ways of viewing it. For those who do believe it as a belief system, and you can partake in that or believe it or not, I think what might be beneficial is coming back to story, is thinking about how, stories affect people's lives, and how stories actually are the real things that affect change and the ways people might view something and view a belief system. And I'll just maybe cite one example, that when I teach this in courses at UBC, I look at climate change from a little bit of different angle, since climate change is so polarizing. And that story, you bring that up and immediately you have people shut you on or off. There's not an engagement. I kind of take it from a different direction, where some of my research has looked at, and that is energy change, like how we use energy systems. And climate change, is 90% caused by fossil fuel energy, right? That's the primary issue, and what we've created for ourselves over the last 200, 250 years, depending on how you want to look at fossil fuels. And right now we're trying to think of a new story around fossil fuels. That's another major shift that's happening. And there's a lot of positive, even though it looks not so positive, there actually are a lot of quite positive changes around that. And so once I shift the story or shift the conversation to an energy, and then I ask people, students or other participants, if I'm doing a workshop, what is your energy story? And they kind of look at me like, well, what is that? What do you mean? And I say, well, tell me about how energy, what your relationship has been with energy in your lives. You know, when you grew up, what was energy like? Where did you grow up? Where did your parents or relatives work? Did they work in the energy sector? Did you live in a, I mean, because Canada is an energy producing economy. So the chances are, if you're from Canada, most people have had a relationship with energy in their lives, in their childhood, in their adult lives, and they've had family members that have worked in it. And so once you personalize it and you have them start to think about their stories around that, and they start to talk about how, you know, their father worked for, you know, an energy company and how that really provided for them, and there's a real protection around that, and there's a real sense of loyalty, suddenly the stories kind of start to unfold some of the biases around why they might not want climate change to happen, because there's a way in which you know, that might affect their lives. And so getting at the climate question is really surreptitiously moving to thinking about energy. And I think that's in some ways a much more productive way, because we're only going to fix climate change if we can fix the energy situation. If we can shift and transition off of fossil fuel energy, you know, rapidly, then we have a chance. If we can't, we don't have a chance. It's really that simple. And so in some ways, I think the more stories we think about energy, the more we're going to be wanting to influence and partake in creating a society that is transitioning off of fossil fuels, and supporting other forms of energy, and, you know, thinking about the ways we use energy and how we might use less of it. And we don't necessarily need to live a life that has so much energy, an energy intensive society. So storytelling kind of diffuses some of those biases, the political aspects, because it personalizes it. And suddenly it's not just this head or this idea. We've embodied this story, and we have a story. And for those who you know, might be quite upset that other people don't believe in climate change, there's more compassion now. There's a sense in which I get where you're coming from. I understand why you would have that position. I see you in a different way. So, you know, not that the book is about environmentalism, but in many ways we are rewriting our environmental story as we speak. And many people in my classes or in other kinds of situations are rewriting their relationships with energy, but also with how we think about living in a post-carbon world, and how climate change is one of the, you know, major issues about human survival moving in the next 50 years. And that's a story that we cannot deny, and everything connects to it. Yeah.
And what's also interesting about that example is, I think to a certain degree, and you mentioned this in the book, there's a whole chapter about scarcity culture and fear culture, and how scarcity culture can totally coexist with a consumerist culture. And, you know, how, I guess the question I want to ask really is, how does the power of love fit into storytelling and into the anecdote to fear and the anecdote to scarcity, and speak to human connection and our interconnection to ourselves and our ability to generate and create?
Well, you know, love is so subjective for so many people. But at the same time, when you asked me earlier about what is generativity, what is a generative story, you know, and then I talked about creating a soil. Well, to have a good soil, you need love in that soil, right? And what that love is might look very different for different cultures and different societies and different families and different people. So I don't know what that looks like, and there's not one way to say what it looks like, but there is a sense that we all sort of inherently and intuitively know what that is, and we know what it is when it's working. And so I would say that in terms of storytelling, there definitely has to be that consciousness of love. And when we're thinking about the kinds of stories, like if we're rewriting stories, and in some ways it's a two-part process in terms of socially. If we're thinking we've been guided by these certain stories for a long time, as I like to joke, sort of the triad, the evil triad of patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, they kind of all work off of each other. And at the end of the day, it does create a society of oppression and competition and separation and all the kinds of things that create all sorts of problems. But if we're going to I think, many people are unhappy with how those stories have become and how they've created a society. And people want that change, and they want something new. But then that's oftentimes the barrier. What do you do with that, right? How do you rewrite a story? How do you think about that from a sociocultural standpoint, not just an individual standpoint? And so, that's a process where you need some ingredients in there. You need to be drawing on traditions, on beliefs that are going to create generative storytelling. And I think love is very much at the center of that, which you might say breeds things like compassion, right? That breeds aspects of empowerment, of, as I talk about in the book, sort of emotional intelligence or observational intelligence or other forms of knowing and being in the world that go beyond just the cerebral sort of brain or the cognitive aspects in which we're oftentimes so governed by. So I guess that's my somewhat short answer to a kind of a complicated question, because it would be more, or I could put it back at you or the person who I'm talking to say, how does love manifest in your stories, right? I mean, that's really, I think, the question that we ask ourselves. And we say, where do I see love in my stories? And how do I infuse more of that when I'm rewriting a story of my own, whether it's what job I want to do or who I want to, be in relationship with romantically or personally, where does love come in, and what value sets are a part of that, because that is challenging. But those are the questions I think that we have to be asking ourselves and inquire in order to create these stories, right? This is part of that process.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering what your grandest hope is for this book, and what the outcome will be, and what it will generate. What is the fruit you're hoping to reap from this book that you've planted in the soil and that has kind of started to grow? Is there something you'd like to see?
Well, I think what I would like to see is more people, whether it's through this book or not, but part of this is, what can I contribute? What can I do to make this happen globally? And what I really would hope is that more of us can see that we have a capacity to create fundamental change. We always have that capacity, no matter how challenging things may seem, that we, and I say we individually and simultaneously collectively, because the more we do individually, the more it affects society, the more society functions this way, the more it affects individuals. Again, it's that reciprocal relationship. How we can and need to rewrite our stories. And we're in that process now. We're already doing it. So partake in that, embrace those storytelling qualities, embrace, as I say in one part of the book, cultivate your creativity, draw on some of these aspects of yourself that are valuable, because everyone's stories are valuable, right? And for people to tell their stories and to tell them more often, and for us to listen to those stories. That's the other thing. It's easy to tell your stories for some, but sometimes listening to those stories might be much more challenging. And I think creating more capacity to listen to these stories. And again, I'm one tiny voice in a multiverse of people telling stories. And I published this book to kind of encourage and try to push that out there. So if this book helps people and it helps people influence other people to listen and tell their stories, then that's a primary goal. But it's also that aspect of, I feel like I'm contributing that process, and I think that's valuable, to feel like we're all contributing in that way. Even if you're meditating in a hut in the middle of nowhere, you're still contributing to the consciousness of the universe and how that might shift. And we all have these tools and abilities. So how do I use my position and the privilege that I have to do certain things to support that? So, you know, that's my goal, to get that out there, and for people to hear that, whether they're, you know, educators, which is an audience I speak to a lot, or, you know, you're, you know, working, you know, we're construction, or whether you are a yoga teacher, or whether you're retired, it really doesn't matter. You name it. Everyone has things to say. And maybe the takeaway is, not only would I encourage people to start practicing thinking about their own stories and telling their own stories and seeing how that changes their life, but starting to listen to other people's stories more, or even ask them and encourage them to tell their stories and actually listen to them. That practice has really profound effects, I think, on a society. And, you know, we'll see where we're at here in the future, but that would be my hope. In 5 or 10 years, we've seen a significant shift, and that we have really begun in earnest to rewrite a global story.
You know, I thought it would be really nice to end with the quote from Toni Morrison that you actually started with in the book, because I think it really speaks to our time right now. Do you have the book handy? Do you want to read it?
I could do, but if you have it, I actually would prefer your narrating a capacity here, since you're, you know, the expert.
Maybe, can you tell us a little bit about why you chose that to start the book?
Well, it's just a fabulous quote. And I think it's one of the quotes that influenced me when I was thinking about how to pull this book together. And I came across this, and I just said, this is exactly why I'm trying to do this. And of course, Toni Morrison is a mammoth, you know, maybe arguably, I would say personally, probably the greatest American novelist, you know, has that sort of moniker about her. And you know, has just done so much to rewrite society's story through her fiction, and her not just that, but also through her lecturing, her speaking, her teaching. I mean, she's done it in so many ways, and have influenced so many contemporary storytellers. So I think that's why I wanted to draw it in. And I started the book with it because I felt as though it was maybe a good warning of what people were getting into, you know, in the sense that the way she engages this situation, and maybe I could lead it up, or I don't know how much you want to read of it.
Go ahead. Yes, absolutely.
So, you know, she wrote this, I think it was 2005, and she wrote it for 150th anniversary issue of, was it the National magazine? I have my book here.
The Nation's 150th anniversary. Yeah.
Yeah. And she was writing about a conversation she had with friends about feeling really uninspired, feeling like there was no hope, feeling like, what's the point? And this was, of course, in the midst of the Iraq War, and the second term of the Bush-Cheney administration right after this. And there was this sense of, we're not able to rewrite these stories. We're not actually we're not making those efforts for social change. And she admits that it was kind of a moment of just feeling a little bit down. And then she connected with a friend who's an artist, who kind of gave her some advice and helped her around this. And she sort of rewrote her story even in that moment about how she was going to respond to this feeling that she had. So how's that for a lead up here?
Perfect. And she said, there is no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. This is how civilizations heal. And I guess that's the invitation of your book and this conversation. It's an invitation for people to do language and contribute to the healing collectively and individually that we hope to see.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's been such a delight. I really enjoyed our conversation, and really hope that it does inspire people to both share their stories and listen to the stories of others.
Great. Thanks so much. And thanks for having me on and talking about this to help people share their stories.